This is an ABC News special report. Now reporting, David Muir.
Good afternoon. We're coming on the air for this historic moment in American history, the verdict in the first criminal trial ever against a former president of the United States. Here in New York, the jury a short time ago alerting the judge it has reached a decision in the Donald Trump hush money trial. Trump, of course, is facing 34 felony counts in this case, accused of falsifying business records to cover up $130,000 in hush money payments to Stormy Daniels in the weeks before the 2016 presidential election. I want to go live down to the courthouse. Our senior investigative correspondent, Eric Kotursky, who has been there every step of the way inside that courtroom. He's live outside the courthouse. Aaron, the note from the jury that they do have a verdict.
It came after about 10 hours of deliberations over the last 2 days, David, and about 6 years after this investigation of former President Trump began by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. And it came as something of a surprise because moments before the judge announced that the jury had reached a verdict, he said he was going to be sending them home. And then there was a delay, a pause before the judge came back out onto the bench and very quietly announced, almost mumbling, that the jury had reached a verdict, and it jolted everyone in their seat. Former President Trump, in fact, had been laughing and joking with his defense attorney, Todd Blanche. Prosecutors had been smiling and sharing pleasantries, but everyone instantly became ramrod straight. Court officers flooded into the courtroom, and the jury asked for a few extra minutes to fill out the paperwork. It is a complicated verdict form because there are 34 counts of falsifying business records in order to cover up an alleged conspiracy to corrupt the 2016 election. So the jury wants to be very careful with the paperwork, David. We're just waiting for them to come back into the room.
Aaron, a couple of very basic questions to bring people along right here with us. Again, the jury in Donald Trump's criminal trial here in New York, short time ago, alerting the judge that they do have a verdict in this case. Bottom line here, Aaron, that means they've decided guilt or not guilty. This does not mean there's any chance here of a mistrial because they've told the judge we have a verdict.
That's right. They have told the judge we have a verdict. Now, it could be a mixed verdict. They do not have to decide, the same verdict for all 34 counts. It is, again, a bit complicated. The former president is accused of falsifying checks, invoices, ledger entries at the Trump Organization. So it could be that some they believe he falsified and some not. We'll wait to see what it is, but we do believe they have been able to reach unanimity on each of those 34 counts, but we'll wait to see.
An extraordinary sequence of events late today. Aaron Kotursky describing for us the scene in that courtroom late this afternoon when it appeared that jurors were getting ready to be sent home by that judge in the case. Obviously, 2 days now of deliberations. And then, as Aaron just reported moments ago, the judge then informing the court that instead of going home, they would deliver a verdict in this case, this criminal trial involving former President Donald Trump. And as we have mentioned many times before, obviously an historic moment in this country, the first time a former president has been on trial. We're waiting now to hear from the jury, made up, of course, of 7 men, 5 women. Those jurors deliberating for about 10 hours right there in Lower Manhattan. They could vote to acquit on all charges, convict on all charges, or as Aaron mentioned there a moment ago, they could split this verdict. They could find the former president guilty on some counts, not guilty on others. Of course, we're simply going to wait to hear what they have decided. You can see the makeup of the jury. And Aaron, if you could enlighten us here, I know that you have studied this as you've covered this trial, but we have Americans from all walks of life. His peers here in New York City, there are a couple of lawyers on this jury. Tell us more about those who will be deciding his fate.
The 5-woman, 7-man jury reflects the diverse richness of Manhattan. They come from all the varied neighborhoods of the borough, and it includes a teacher, a couple of lawyers, as you mentioned, which has been much speculated about their potential role on the jury. But it also includes 2 native New Yorkers, 2 immigrants, one from Ireland, the foreman, by default, because he was the first juror seated. There's also an immigrant from Lebanon, and all of them pledged, David, to be fair and impartial. And the judge reminded them in giving them jury instructions before deliberations that they needed to adhere to that, to be fair, to be impartial, and not to let any views, either for or against former President Trump, influence the way they judged the evidence. All of them at the outset said they could do that, David.
Aaron, tell us how we expect to see this play out. Of course, none of us can be sure until it actually plays out in that courtroom. But how do we believe this verdict will be delivered? And how soon could we hear what they've decided here?
The jury had indicated at 4:20 p.m. Eastern Time that they had a verdict, but they wanted some extra minutes to fill out the paperwork. So that time has all but elapsed. So any moment now, we expect that the jury will be brought back into the courtroom. Everyone will be asked to rise, including former President Trump. The jury will take their seats, and then the judge will ask the foreman, this man from Ireland who used to work as a waiter. He now works in sales, and because he was the first juror seated, was selected the foreman by default. He will be asked by the judge whether the jury has reached a verdict, and then he will be asked to announce what it is for each of the 34 counts. Once he has gone through those 34 counts, the jury, all 12 members of the jury, will be polled individually to make sure that that is indeed the verdict. And at that point, it will be officially rendered.
Aaron, as you point out, there are 34 felony counts here that he's been charged with, the former president. And each one of these counts begins with essentially this allegation that the former president, Donald Trump, made and caused a false entry into the business records of an enterprise to, and then again, each description of each count then plays out. For example, the first count is an invoice from Michael Cohen dated February 14th, 2017. And then there are a number of these counts, 34 in all. And again, Aaron, as you pointed out there, I mentioned a moment ago as well, this jury could find the former president guilty on some of these counts, not guilty on others. Obviously, the other couple of scenarios, guilty on all or not guilty on all.
That's right. Any of those scenarios would be possible, and it's impossible to know how the jury arrived at the verdict they did. Perhaps we'll learn one day. But the invoices, the checks, the ledger entries that you saw there a moment ago on the screen are the allegedly falsified business records, and they all relate to a reimbursement in monthly installments to Donald Trump's former fixer and lawyer, Michael Cohen. On the eve of the 2016 election, he had paid porn actress Stormy Daniels $130,000 in hush money. And when Trump reimbursed Cohen in those monthly installments, that's when prosecutors said he falsified the business records to try to hide it from voters. They called it a scheme to hoodwink voters by keeping crucial information about former President Trump's past from voters in 2016. And prosecutors said in closing arguments, David, that may well have been what allowed Trump to win, suggesting these falsified documents changed the course of American presidential history. And now we await a verdict that may well affect another election come November.
And the prosecution, as part of that argument, saying it may have affected, but it might not have affected the election, but trying to make the case before that jury that voters at home should have been able to make that decision based on all of the information at hand. But we'll see what the jury decides here. I'm joined by our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, on the phone. And I just want to say to all of our contributors, we'll have to interrupt the moment we begin to hear what this verdict is on all of these 34 counts. But in the meantime, Dan, for our viewers watching ABC News live coverage here of the verdict in Donald Trump's criminal trial, you and I were on the air last night here, Dan, with those first two requests from the jury, and they were somewhat telling. 4 hours in, a very specific request from those jurors to look back at testimony, to have testimony reread from David Pecker, a former publisher of the National Enquirer, of Michael Cohen, of course, Donald Trump's one-time lawyer and fixer, about, in particular, a meeting allegedly that took place at Trump Tower. All three men involved in that meeting, according to the testimony, in addition to phone calls and other testimony that they requested. But that particular request was somewhat telling. And what could it potentially signal here without getting ahead of ourselves?
Right. So that's exactly what the prosecutors would have wanted them to start with, right? Because from the prosecutor's perspective, this is a scheme that started in 2015. It started at the Trump Tower with a meeting between David Pecker and Michael Cohen and Donald Trump talking about how they would keep an eye out. David Pecker would keep an eye out for negative stories, that he would help pay for them. They would end up, quoting, killing them. Catch and kill was the scheme. But the reason it's important that they asked for that readback is David Pecker was the corroborating witness for Michael Cohen, right? Again and again, we talked in this case about Michael Cohen's credibility problems. And the prosecution's argument was, yes, he's got credibility problems, but we believe we have corroborated all the key elements of his testimony. And the beginning of that corroboration starts with the 2015 meeting, where David Pecker and Michael Cohen are basically relaying the same account of how this all started. So that was definitely a good sign for prosecutors, that was the beginning of the jury's deliberative process. Again, it was impossible to know exactly what it meant. Did it mean that they were following the prosecution's roadmap? Did it mean that there was some dissent on the jury and they were trying to resolve outstanding issues? We didn't know. We still don't know for certain right now. But based on the speed of the verdict, you've got to believe that at least the prosecutors here are probably encouraged by the fact that a verdict has been reached.
And Dan, you and I, in talking on World News Tonight last night here, talked about the potential possibility that would have signaled some sort of dissent. In addition to those questions, those very specific questions, the second request that came about an hour later, early in the deliberations, was that the jury instructions from the judge be reread to the jury. And this was just hours after he had instructed them on jury instructions to begin with. So when we were talking on the air about the potential for any daylight between some of the jurors, it would appear whatever dissension there might have been clearly has been taken care of over the course of just 2 days. And what does that tell you from covering so many of these cases?
Well, look, this is a unanimous verdict. You needed a unanimous verdict. 11-1 for conviction or 11-1 for acquittal would be a hung jury. But remember, and we talked about this last night, was that New York has a kind of quirky interpretation of law, that in most cases, the vast majority of cases, the jurors don't get to bring with them the jury instructions back into the jury room. In most states, in federal court, you give the jurors the jury instructions. They
Dan,
get to
let me
bring
just
them
interrupt
back.
you. Let me interrupt you right there. They didn't get a copy of the jury instructions, which is why they asked for them to be read back. Dan can elaborate on that in a moment. I do want to let the audience know that Judge Juan Merchan back in that courtroom. Of course, no cameras in the court, which you are well aware of from our coverage, weeks now of our coverage. The judge back in that courtroom, set to bring the jury back into the courtroom as well to deliver this verdict. Again, you can't say it enough that this is an historic moment for the country, because we have never witnessed a criminal trial of a former president of the United States. The president, Donald Trump, the former president, in that courtroom too. Our reporters there in the courtroom and in what we call the overflow room, given eyes and ears on the court for us, are reporting in that Donald Trump is sitting at the defense table, his arms very tightly crossed. They describe him as stone-faced, nodding as his attorney whispers into his ear. And as you know, after weeks of coverage, that there is a courtroom where they allow reporters to go in to witness the proceedings for the entire day. Our team has been in there every single day, right there along with the former president. And John Carl, you are one of the correspondents who has spent time in that courtroom. It must be a surreal scene, not only for the jurors who must decide a former president's fate, but for the former president himself. And we heard about this in closing arguments, that not only did the defense make its case, the prosecution make its case directly, aiming their arguments, their closings at the jury, but almost the entire time, the former president looking over at that jury too, studying those jurors' faces. And John, I apologize in advance if I have to interrupt you, but an extraordinary scene over these last several days inside that courtroom.
I mean, David, a scene unlike any we have seen in American history. a former president of the United States, and not just a former president of the United States, but a current candidate for president of the United States, again, sitting just, feet away from the jury that would decide his fate. And he can see perfectly clear their expressions as they're hearing the key witnesses, as they're hearing the key evidence. And when the jury walks in, the entire court must stand up, and the jury walks right in front of Donald Trump and his legal team and the prosecutors on their way to the jury box. And it was interesting. I was in there for 2 very critical days of testimony. Michael Cohen testifying, obviously the central witness in this case. And for the most part, the jurors avoid eye contact with Donald Trump as they pass right in front of him and sit in that jury box.
And John Carl, we've just been told by our reporters who are there in the courtroom today, John, we'll get back to you, that the former president, Donald Trump, did stand as the judge entered that courtroom, fixing his jacket, taking a deep breath in the courtroom for those who can see him, able to witness that. One of our reporters down there on the scene reporting that suddenly there are many more court officers in the room, Secret Service supervisor standing in the back of that room. As you know, any court case here in New York involves a significant amount of security. This is unprecedented. There has been security there every single day of this trial. And many of these officers, when asked previously, when do you get to go home, they are there for the entirety of these days, these proceedings. So even yesterday, for example, after the jurors left for the day, both sides, the defense, the prosecution, had to agree on the kind of testimony that would be reread back to the jurors, those requests made by that jury, that those officers, everybody in that court responsible for keeping the courtroom safe would stay into the evening, along with the court reporters who would then have to read this testimony back. That's what played out this morning. Court reporters reading back the testimony that had been agreed upon by both sides, the defense and the prosecution. And then the judge, we knew Judge Juan Merchan would ask the jury, do you want all of the jury instructions read back to you or particular instructions? And that was how he was able to zero in, laser in on what it is they were looking for to have read back to them. I want to bring in Aaron Katersky again, live outside the courthouse. Aaron, it's our understanding the judge back in that courtroom, Donald Trump standing as the judge entered the court. What do we know about the jury at this point?
The jury has just entered the courtroom, David, filing right past former President Trump on their way in. Most of the jurors appeared to avoid eye contact as they took their seats in the jury box. The judge is now formally reading into the record the note indicating there's a verdict.
We are learning right now, Aaron, the foreperson is standing in that courtroom. Let's wait for reporting from inside the courtroom. The control room listening to this very closely. Aaron, you are as well from our team inside the courtroom and in the overflow. The verdict is now being read. As you can see on the screen here, count 1, guilty. Count 2, the former president found guilty. Count 3, guilty. We await count 4 here. As you can see, the first 3 counts, the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, found guilty of 3 felony counts so far. The foreperson in that courtroom. Count 4, guilty. Count 5, guilty. Count 6, guilty. As we continue to enter in what we're learning from the courtroom, it's our belief that first 19 counts, I'm being told, the former president has been found guilty of. Counts 20 through 23 found guilty as well. So correct me, control room, all the way through count 23 now found guilty. We are now up to count 26 and count 27 found guilty as well. So again, I'm going to pause here. He's been found guilty 31 counts now of guilty as we wait for the graphic to catch up to the reporting coming from the courthouse. Count 33 and counts 34 coming in right now. Guilty on all counts. This jury in New York City a jury of his peers finding the former president guilty on every single felony count brought against him by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Aaron Katersky outside the courthouse. Let's go to you for first reaction.
An incredible verdict on this day in May, late May. The former president of the United States convicted as charged. 34 counts of falsifying business records. And David, as the crowd outside this courthouse found out, a big cheer went up from opponents of the former president who had been massing in the park across the street from the courthouse. Just a whooping cheer, and they continue to make a lot of noise. There have been supporters of the former president here as well. It looks like many of them are hanging in there, but are remaining silent as the former president has been convicted on all 34 counts of falsifying business records, meaning, David, the jury believed the Manhattan District Attorney's theory of the case that the former president falsified these records to cover up a conspiracy to corrupt the 2016 election by hiding lewd stories from his past. David?
Aaron, as we know from the instructions from the judge in this case, Juan Merchan, telling that jury that they could not convict solely on the testimony of Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's longtime former fixer, friend, and attorney, that there must be corroborating evidence in this case that they also believe in coming up with any sort of verdict. I glean from that then in the discussions within that jury room, and we will learn more in the days ahead, that they then pointed to other evidence, and we know about the request that they look at testimony from David Pecker, for example, to be reread back to them this morning, that is the kind of corroborating evidence that they must have leaned in on to come up with 34 guilty findings on every count here. The former president found guilty as we're on the air this afternoon. Aaron, again, testimony from David Pecker and other evidence presented by the prosecution, they must have leaned on, not solely the testimony of Michael Cohen here.
They were told they couldn't rely solely on Michael Cohen because he was an accomplice in the alleged, or now found, scheme to corrupt the 2016 election. And so they did need corroborating evidence and testimony, and they may have found it in the testimony of David Pecker, because one of the things they asked to hear again today was how both men described a meeting in August of 2015, 2 months after Donald Trump had announced his candidacy, when prosecutors said this conspiracy was hatched. David Pecker at the National Enquirer would buy and bury unflattering stories. He said he agreed to be the eyes and ears of the Trump campaign, and prosecutors said it amounted to a campaign finance violation. And Michael Cohen described the meeting very much the same way, saying that he recalled Pecker telling Trump he would be the eyes and ears of the Trump campaign. Perhaps that was the corroborating evidence and testimony that the jury needed, David. They also wanted to make sure they understood the judge's instructions of how to find out how to convict somebody of falsification of business records. And the judge told them that even if Trump didn't personally falsify the records, that he could be found guilty if he caused other people, like an accounting department at the Trump Organization or Michael Cohen or someone else, to falsify those records on his behalf.
All right, Aaron Katersky, stay with us here. Aaron Katersky, who has covered every day of this trial for us outside the courthouse there. Obviously, we also have a team inside court, both in the courtroom and in this overflow room. And I just want to bring everyone at home watching our ABC News Live coverage here of an historic day here. The former president, Donald Trump, found guilty on all 34 counts in the hush money case that involved Stormy Daniels in the lead up to the 2016 election. Found guilty again on all counts by a jury of his peers. Again, we know the makeup of this jury come from a cross-section of life in this country. 2 attorneys among that jury pool. It's been said in other cases along the way that the prosecution doesn't always like having lawyers sitting in that jury box, but in this case, both sides agreed to those 2 jurors in particular, lawyers who perhaps, as we'll find out in the days to come, might have helped explain some of the very detailed detailed jury instructions from Judge Juan Merchan. Again, the former president you see there on the screen found guilty on all counts. Some of the color coming in from the courtroom from our team. The former president, Donald Trump, watching very closely as the jury was polled. They all replied yes when asked if this was their verdict. The district attorney himself, Alvin Bragg, stern-faced in the courtroom. Todd Blanche was the one who asked to poll the jury. Of course, that is the lead defense attorney in this case for Donald Trump. Donald Trump watching again as they were being polled, looking over at the jury as each one of them was individually polled on the verdict. One of our reporters describing the former president as slumped over in his chair, slumped somewhat, looking at the jury as they delivered the verdict, adjusting his head each time to get a look at each of the jurors as, again, they were polled individually. So, again, just describing, and it's obviously the limitations of the court system here in New York, no cameras in court. But as we know, we've described to you what would happen. The judge would enter that courtroom. Donald Trump would stand along with others in that courtroom. The jury then re-entering, the foreperson standing, saying, we do have a verdict. The judge asking the foreperson what that verdict would be. And then we watched even the screen here, the graphics could not keep up with the speed at which the verdict was delivered. 34 counts. All 34 of them, the former president found guilty in this hush money case. I want to bring in Dan Abrams with us just as we came on the air, now with me here in the studio. And Dan, you and I have talked. There were all sorts of plausible scenarios here, what the jury could decide. Perhaps guilty on some counts, not guilty on others. Obviously, the chance of a mistrial or a hung jury, it would take just one juror for that scenario. That's not what played out this afternoon. To have 34 counts and to have a jury find over the course of 2 days the former president guilty on all 34 counts. What does this say to you?
So let's be clear. If there had been a split verdict, if there had been convictions on, let's say, 9, just the ones, for example, where Donald Trump had signed the checks, it would have been unlikely, unusual. Most people watching this case expected either there's going to be an acquittal, there'll be a hung jury, or they'll be guilty on all charges. It would have been surprising if the jurors had split the verdicts, because it's really all basically the same set of facts. It's just a question of which ledger and which check. So either you believe it or you don't. And so the fact that it's 34, we have to be careful here, right? Let's not overstate what that means. Because, for example, when it comes to sentencing, it's not as if the sentence is going to involve 34 counts where each count ends up being served consecutively. There is almost no doubt that whatever sentence happens here, the sentence will be concurrent, meaning all of it will be served at the same time for the 34. So in effect,
talk about a sentence.
Yeah.
So let me stop you right there, because viewers at home are going to ask immediately, what does this mean? Could the former president be sentenced to potential time behind bars? We know there is the potential for that, though extremely unlikely for a first-time offender, correct?
I think it is unlikely. This is the lowest level felony in the state of New York. We talk about misdemeanors versus felonies, but there's also different levels of felony. This is a Class E felony, the lowest kind. Donald Trump has never been convicted of a crime before. I think as a result, it is unlikely, not impossible, that he would be sentenced to prison time in connection with this case. There are other options, right? There is probation. I think the other potential option could be home confinement. Can you imagine that? And in an effort, if it were to happen before the election, someone who wants to be out on the campaign trail. Again, I think any serving of a sentence, though, very unlikely to happen before the election. A number of things will happen first. First, he'll do an interview with the probation department. That is typical in any case. You have a meeting where you talk to he's going to have this meeting with a probation officer, because the probation department then recommends what sentence they think the person ought to get. And then number 2 is a sentencing happen weeks, months ahead. There's going to be appeals in this case, et cetera. So I think that the actual serving of the sentence, whatever it is probably some time away.
Some time away. Judge Juan Merchan will take into account whatever the probation officer suggests after this meeting that you say will take place, regardless of whether you're sitting across from somebody who does what you and I do, or somebody who works in sort of any sector here in New York City and beyond. But this is the former president of the United States who will also have to sit across from this probation officer. How soon would we then hear from Judge Juan Merchan what the sentence will be?
So I think that we're going to see when the sentencing date is set, right? So we're watching some people
We are watching the courthouse very closely. Donald Trump was expected to be able to leave the courtroom today. Of course, as Dan mentioned, the sentencing will not come for many weeks here. Not expected, certainly. We are expecting the former president to leave the courthouse. Have we seen him in front of the camera yet? We have not seen him yet, as we know that he generally addresses reporters when he comes out of the courtroom. There's no promise here that he will today. Sentencing is set for early July. July 11th is what we've been told. Judge Juan Merchan will deliver the sentence on July 11th, which is obviously a little more than a month from now. There is no bail. He will leave court today, a free man for now, certainly. And as you heard Dan report there, and legal analysts across the board have said that jail time in this case extremely, extremely unlikely. But obviously it leads to some immediate questions right away when you're talking about the presumptive Republican nominee in the race for the White House. Does it change the race? At least right now, it doesn't. He can continue to run for president regardless of this conviction on 34 felony counts today. Some have asked, will Donald Trump be able to vote? I had been doing some reading on that because he now has residency in Florida. In the state of Florida, Dan, they often defer to where the case was tried. Is that not correct?
Correct.
So in New York, they allow certain felons to vote of certain categories, right? So it's my understanding that Donald Trump would potentially be able to vote. But let's watch the former president expected to address the cameras. Let's listen.
Are you worried about going to jail? This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA, and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end and we'll win, because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists, and they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble. But this was a rigged decision right from day one, with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
Why should voters vote for a convicted felon?
Todd Blanche at the president's side. Todd Blanche, the defense attorney, the president turning around, not taking any questions. Former President Donald Trump, a short time after listening to the foreperson deliver the guilty verdict on all 34 counts. Todd Blanche then asking each juror to be polled, each juror then saying that they agreed with the finding. This was unanimous, all 34 counts found guilty. The former president moments ago saying this is a disgrace, this was a rigged trial, a rigged decision, and immediately turning to the race for president, saying the real verdict will come on November 5th from the American people. He went on to say, I'm a very innocent man, and again, called the whole process rigged. John Carl, our chief Washington correspondent. John, not surprising here that there would be an immediate pivot now to November.
No, and not surprising at all. And Donald Trump will do what he's done when he was indicted in this case and in 3 other cases, which is say that this is a politically charged effort to hurt his campaign for president. The question is, Donald Trump is now a convicted felon. Will that affect how voters will view him? And we have seen, David, a lot of polling, including one of our ABC News polls just in the past month, that suggests that upwards of 20% of people who have said that they plan to vote for Donald Trump for president would reconsider whether or not they would vote for him if he were in fact convicted of a felony. So the question is, now that he has been convicted of a felony by a duly charged jury, will those voters who have been solidly for him now reconsider whether or not they still want to vote for Donald Trump to be president of the United States again, now that he is a convicted felon? Again, the polling suggests that at least a significant percentage, roughly 1/5 of those voters, will reconsider that. Now that it's out there, we'll see.
John, stick with us here. We want to go full to this WABC picture from our station here in New York City, Channel 7, with live pictures over the courthouse here in Lower Manhattan. Donald Trump, the former president, obviously expected to leave the courthouse. A significant security, not both because it's the New York State criminal court, but also Secret Service, and they had been prepared for any possibility here. Though he leaves today, obviously a free man. We know that the sentencing will be July 11th, which I believe is 4 days before the start of the Republican National Convention. John Karl hits at a very important point politically, and which is the central question of whether or not this changes the dynamic in the race for president in this country. We don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here on that, but as you know, we've been reporting for many weeks now, this race, even though we are still very early on, is a very close race in this country. They are within a point or two of one another, President Biden and former President Trump, as the country, takes a deep breath and prepares itself for a rematch. The polling consistently shows that the American people did not want these two to play this out all over again in front of the country, but that is where we're headed. And now the question, as John Karl brings up, is whether or not this shifts the dynamic at all. Of course, some political pundits will say this was sort of baked in, that Donald Trump supporters had been bracing for anything here, that it won't change the dynamic at all, if much at all, for those who are loyal Donald Trump supporters. And the question, though, given how tight the race is, this is going to be a presidential race. Most observers say that will be decided at the margins. It's very, very close. So even if it changes the minds of people in the very middle, independent voters who don't like their choices, for example, that's going to be something that is really studied in the days and weeks ahead, and how the political arguments might shift. We heard from Donald Trump here moments ago that he immediately is pivoting to the November election, saying that that is when the true verdict will be delivered in this country, that verdict by the American people when they vote in this presidential race. Mary Bruce, our chief White House correspondent, obviously covering any reaction from the White House, any reaction from President Biden. Has the Biden campaign engaged at all on the news just moments ago that the former president, for the first time in history, has been found guilty on 34 felony counts?
David, we are still awaiting any kind of official response from the campaign, though our team has heard that there were cheers inside the Biden headquarters in Wilmington as the verdict was read. Look, President Biden has been very careful in the last weeks not to comment on this trial. That, I have been told, will now change now that we have a verdict. Obviously, these guilty verdicts are a political gift to Democrats, a political gift to the president. He is now running against a convicted felon. But don't expect the president to completely upend his campaign messaging because of this, I am told. This verdict is not now going to somehow become the centerpiece of his messaging to the American people. The Biden team is very well aware of former President Trump's argument, as we just heard, his claims that this is all somehow rigged. The president doesn't want to be overly celebratory and feed in to that narrative that this was somehow a witch hunt concocted by President Biden. He has been adamant that he had nothing to do with this. He has said that he has never had a single conversation with anyone in his administration, with the Justice Department, anyone about Donald Trump's legal troubles. What you can expect the president do, though, is to continue to argue that Donald Trump, he believes, is unfit to serve, and he will make the argument that ultimately it is up to voters to decide Donald Trump's future. Because as we have been noted, even if he does face any kind of prison time, that is likely, unlikely, but even if it does happen, not likely to happen, certainly before an election. And so the president is going to make the argument that this ultimately comes down to the ballot.
With just a few seconds here, Mary, before I turn back to our courtroom reporters, President Biden has very rarely even addressed the fact that this criminal trial was taking place. At times, you would report that he would say something along the lines of his opponent is tied up today, a sort of nod to nudge, if you will, to the Trump campaign about what was playing out here in New York City. But other than that, there has been very little said about this criminal trial.
Yeah, he would subtly needle his opponent over this, right? We all recall when he had challenged him to that debate saying, I hear you're free on Wednesdays, which was the day that obviously court was not in session. But beyond that sort of subtle jabbing and not so subtle sort of jokes, you didn't hear the president really comment on the substance much because he wanted to keep his distance, because he didn't want to feed into that narrative that Trump and his supporters have been pushing, that this is all a political hit job. The president is going to react to this, I am told. The question is how he does it, in what form, and how, fiercely and forcefully he now brings this up on the campaign trail going forward. Just how much will Donald Trump, being a convicted felon, play a role? How much of a role will it play in the president's campaign speeches going forward? We are going to wait and see. Forgive me for constantly looking at my phone here, David, because we are expecting hopefully some kind of reaction from the campaign very soon. Stand by. It has actually just landed in our inbox. So if you bear with me here while I read this, this is a statement from the campaign communication director saying, in New York today, we saw that no one is above the law. Donald Trump has always mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law for his own personal gain. But today's verdict does not change the fact that the American people face a simple reality. There is still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box. Convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. He goes on to say that Trump poses to the threat that Trump poses to our democracy has never been greater. He says he is running an increasingly unhinged campaign of revenge and retribution, pledging to be a dictator on day one, calling for the Constitution to be terminated so he can regain and keep power. The statement concludes by saying a second Trump term means chaos, ripping away Americans' freedoms and fomenting political violence, and the American people will reject it this November. That is the official statement from the Biden-Harris campaign spokesman, David.
Mary Bruce, with reaction just coming in from the Biden campaign. Olivia Rubin, our courtroom reporter, part of our investigative unit here at ABC News. Olivia, you were in the courtroom and in that overflow room so many days during this trial. Can you describe what you witnessed late this afternoon as the jury was called back into that courtroom and the verdict was read, the reaction from the former president in that room?
Well, for the most part, David, a stone-faced Donald Trump in that courtroom, almost motionless the entire time. He sat in his seat, slumped back, the frown we have seen on his face almost every single day inside of that courtroom. And it was no different for most part when he heard the jury read that verdict. But it's so striking, David, because I want to rewind for just a moment, because before the verdict came in, Judge Merchan had called the parties in to tell them essentially that the day was about to be over. Donald Trump thought that he was going home without a verdict today. He just had about 15 minutes to kill. And what we saw was a Donald Trump at that verdict, at the defense table, that we have never seen before. He was joking, he was laughing, he was smiling with Todd Blanche. They were chatting, they were laughing almost incessantly. Todd Blanche laughing so hard at one point, doubling over that his forehead almost touched the table in front of him. They thought that they were going home today. It seemed without a verdict, it was almost a jubilant, giddy Donald Trump. But that changed very, very quickly when Judge Merchan came back into the room to inform the parties that the jury had reached that verdict. And then, of course, it shifted to that original Donald Trump that I just described to you. And something that we noticed, the whole team that has been in there for 7 weeks throughout this case, is how little the jury looked at Donald Trump when they would come in and out of that courtroom every single day. They have to march right by him, just inches away from him, and they hardly ever looked at him. courtroom, David, they looked down at the floor, and it was essentially the same story today. And such a striking scene today to see the jury leave in front of Donald Trump, again, just inches away from him after rendering that guilty verdict, marching in front of him in the line that they have done day in and day out, and again, appearing to look down at the floor once again. But Donald Trump, on that camera that's on him in the overflow room, he was looking at them. He stood in front of them as they passed. He adjusted his tie. So really just a remarkable moment from him, from that jubilant, laughing, giddy Donald Trump, who thought he was going home today with no verdict, to the man sitting at the defense table as they are saying guilty over and over and over again, a convicted felon, David.
Olivia, stay with us here as we're looking at live pictures here from WABC Channel 7 here in New York, our ABC station, obviously trained over the courthouse. We're expecting to see the former president leave the courthouse at any moment. And as Olivia just described, the final moments inside that courtroom today, the judge had indicated that perhaps the jurors would be headed home for the day, that this would go into a third day of deliberations. Olivia describing, a former president and his defense attorney, his main defense attorney, Todd Blanche, as laughing with one another, smiling with each other. And then a stark shift in temperature at that defense table when the judge then moments later said the jury had in fact reached a verdict in this case. And Olivia, as we know, the defense believed that with every day that went by, that was a more positive sign for them. So I would gather at the end of today, late today, when they thought this was going to bleed into a third day of deliberations, there was some relief that we're going to go into another day. And in fact, moments later, that dramatic sort of whiplash moment in the courtroom.
That's right. And I do think what you touched on right there, referring to Todd Blanche and how sort of critical he was to this case and what, he did for Donald Trump over the past few weeks is so interesting to sort of laser in on, and to watch Todd Blanche in the courtroom today was so fascinating. You could feel the intensity from him because this was his moment, this was his case, and he was performing essentially in front of Donald Trump every single day. And what was so fascinating as they are waiting for this verdict to come down, because remember, they had a 30-minute waiting period where they had to sit at the defense table and wait for the verdict. You could see him gripping the tie around his neck, loosening it, the pressure clearly weighing on him. And there were times when all of them sat there really not speaking at all. Again, that 30-minute waiting period, so telling. The prosecutors just feet away from them to their right-hand side, also really saying nothing at all. And then, of course, Alvin Bragg, just a few benches behind them. He had been in the courtroom just a few days, and what was so fascinating about him is how sort of you could feel his intensity in the courtroom as well, at times hunched over papers in his lap. I think at one point I saw him following along with questioning of witnesses, and you could see his tension. He was hunched over his papers once again, furiously taking notes at one point. So really the stakes that were on all parties here. But again, bringing it back to Todd Blanche, this was his case for Donald Trump. He had been front and center. He had done the cross-examination of Michael Cohen. And then when he spoke, David, just one last point, when he spoke to make that motion with Judge Merchan at the end, after the verdict had already been rendered, you could quite literally hear the nervousness and the fluster in his voice as he was speaking to Merchan. He was tripping over his words. He was speaking slowly. He was speaking quietly. And it was just so apparent that the verdict that had just come down was weighing on him as much as it was his client, again, Donald Trump, who remained seated at that defense table before, adjusting his jacket one last time to leave that courtroom. So again, tension for all parties there.
This is just extraordinary color from inside that courtroom. Olivia, stay with us here. A few more questions for you as we also keep our eyes trained on these helicopter shots from Channel 7 here in New York as we await the former president leaving that courthouse. You can see Secret Service assembled. Olivia talking about Alvin Bragg, and for those of you at home who've been following, you certainly know who he is, but we'll bring everybody up to speed. The Manhattan district attorney who brought the case but was not in that courtroom every day, and in fact, his team of prosecutors instead making the arguments. Obviously, Josh Steinglass delivering the closing arguments in this case. Some had wondered if perhaps the closing arguments were too long, particularly from the prosecution. The defense closing was long as well. But there were those who wondered if Mr. Steinglass had gone on too long. I'm certainly of the belief now that he's happy with what he said because he got the verdict that he was looking for. There will be a lot of sort of Monday morning quarterbacking, really, particularly for the defense at this point. Todd Blanche, a respected defense attorney, but there have been questions about the approach during this trial and whether or not it was the right approach in trying to defend the former president against these particular counts. I want to get back to Olivia, though, because, again, in New York, no cameras in the court for this trial. And, Olivia, you were describing the jurors, and I want to laser in on this because, as we heard from Judge Juan Merchan, in his instructions to the jury, he told them, you are deciding the fate of a fellow member of this community, so as to take down the temperature of the moment, the history of the moment, that they know full well this was the former president sitting there before them at the defense table, but also instructing each of those jurors not to allow bias, their own political beliefs to enter into the equation, that they need to find him guilty or not guilty based on the totality of the evidence. And what I mean by that is, in particular, he said, you cannot come up with a verdict here based solely on the testimony of Michael Cohen. There must be corroborating evidence that you've seen in this case in coming up with your decision. For those joining us now, obviously, you know, 34 counts, all 34 counts the former president found guilty of in a Manhattan courtroom here late this afternoon. And Olivia, it would seem those jurors took those instructions to heart, particularly when you talk about the dynamic or lack thereof between those jurors and the former president as they left that courtroom. Again, describe the eye contact the former president was making with them versus the other direction.
Well, I will say, you talk about, the focus of the jury day in and day out inside of the courtroom, David. It is hard to underscore how focused, how laser focused these jurors were on all of the testimony, on the opening arguments, and on the closings, which we know were marathon. They paid attention and took notes during a 5-hour closing argument. That is remarkable. They listened to Todd Blanche. I noticed one juror nodding their head and taking notes as Todd Blanche was delivering his closing. So it appeared to be a jury that was listening so intently to both sides. Though I will also point out, this was not a very expressive jury. They did not give a lot with their facial expressions, with their motions throughout the 20-plus days that they sat through this trial, and that we watched them every single day. But what was so apparent, as I hinted at earlier, was how they just never looked at Donald Trump. It was so rare, although there was one or two jurors that occasionally would look at him when they would go in and out of the courtroom. And that was one of sort of the most remarkable, logistical setups of the courtroom. Every single time that the jury came in for the day, Donald Trump would stand and they would emerge from the left side of the courtroom, a little door, and they would file in a line past Donald Trump across the courtroom and into the jury box where they would take their seats. So for just those 4 or 5 seconds, twice every single day, they were just inches away from the former president and the man whose fate they would ultimately decide. And again, it was so striking how not only would they not look at him, but they would look down at the floor most of the time as they made their way past him, or some of them would try to sort of conveniently turn their neck so that they were facing the other way and trying to look over where Judge Merchan would sit, but really doing anything that they could to not stand in his direction as Donald Trump stood sort of shoulders back tall in his suit in front of them, some of them wearing sneakers, some of them wearing t-shirts occasionally, a really striking dynamic. And then, of course, today, again, with the camera on Donald Trump, watching him watch the 12 jurors who just decided his fate walk out, and yet again, they don't even appear to acknowledge him. And you have, the former leader of the free world, the man who could become president yet again if he is successful, adjusting his suit, adjusting his tie, and sort of slumped over in front of the 12 average New Yorkers who just decided for him and are barely once again even looking at him, David.
Olivia, thank you so much. Stay with us here for our live coverage. We'll come back to you shortly. Olivia Rubin, just one of our team of reporters inside that courthouse throughout the duration of this trial. And as you know at home from our reporting over the course of several nights on this, that it really does come down to the eyes and ears of the reporters in that courthouse to help us get a fuller picture of the dynamic at play. We're getting Republican reaction coming in. We'll get to that in just a moment. But just to add to what Olivia just said, as we await live pictures here, we expect to see perhaps the former president leaving that courthouse. You can see the security arranged outside the courthouse, Secret Service certainly. They had prepared for this moment, no matter what the outcome would be from this jury. We know that the jurors, and this comes from our team inside the courthouse, in addition to Olivia, jurors showing no facial emotions, nodding along with Judge Merchan as he thanked them for their service. He asked them for feedback about the entire process in the future. He said to them, "You are excused with the gratitude of the court." And while he was saying that to the jurors, the defense attorney, Todd Blanche, sitting with his head in his hands at the defense table, his elbows on the table, rubbing his lips, Judge Juan Merchan thanking the jurors for handling a, quote, very stressful and difficult task. And as we heard Olivia Rubin report there, with the exception of looking at the former president now and then as they entered the courtroom day to day, there was very little exchange as far as making eye contact with the former president, the person whose fate was in their hands, although we do know from today's reporting that the former president was studying each one of those jurors, particularly as they were polled individually after this verdict today, each one of them saying yes when asked, "Is this your verdict?" Former President Trump found guilty on 34 felony counts in New York City late today. Rachel Scott, who covers Capitol Hill, who covers the race for president, getting first reaction here on the Republican side. I understand Speaker Johnson has reacted in addition to others.
Yes, David, this reaction from the Republican Party is coming in very quickly. The Speaker of the House issuing a statement calling today a shameful day in American history, calling this purely a political exercise, not a legal one. We're also hearing from several Republican senators, Senator Marco Rubio calling this a complete travesty, Senator John Cornyn calling this verdict a disgrace. Even Trump's former rivals who ran against him in the Republican primary, including Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, calling this all political, saying this was an effort to
stand by because we're watching these live pictures of the former president entering the SUV there in the foreground of your screen. Sorry to interrupt, but let's just watch this scene as it plays out. We'll come back to you for Republican reaction. We also have reaction coming in from members of the Trump family. We know inside that courtroom today, Eric Trump, Donald Trump's son, throughout the course of this trial, he has been there, not necessarily every day, but has often been there. We have seen Don Jr., we've seen Tiffany Trump. Notably absent from the trial itself, Melania Trump and Ivanka Trump. John Santucci, who was watching this picture right along with us here, an extraordinary sight. And you're hearing reaction from the Trump family, in particular, Don Jr.?
Yeah, Donald Trump Jr. being one of the first family members to react to this, David, telling ABC News that, Democrats got what they wanted here. Of course, they have hyped on the fact that New York is a state run by Democrats. Of course, as we know, you mentioned earlier in your conversation with Dan Abrams that, of course, Donald Trump is no longer a New York resident. All of Donald Trump's children, his 3 adult children in particular, who all lived in Manhattan at one point, now reside, of course, in Florida with their father. And Donald Trump Jr., David, telling me that same sentiment that his father echoed in front of the cameras on the 15th floor of that Manhattan courthouse, that voters will now weigh in. Voters will decide this election in November, and that will be the real result and outcome that they will, of course, look forward towards.
John, you know that the Trump family, Donald Trump, watches those polls every single day. He has talked about it as he has left the courtroom in New York under that partial gag order, unable to talk certainly about any witnesses on the stand, but would talk in generic terms about the proceedings of the day, but then would pivot politically to the race for president, obviously. They're very aware of where the race stands. The national polling shows President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump really within a point or two of each other on any given day when these national polls come out. Where Donald Trump has taken note, and I'm certainly sure that you have heard this from inside the Trump campaign, is in the battleground states where we know in the Electoral College these presidential races are decided, and that in several of the key battlegrounds, Donald Trump in recent weeks has shown some steady but very slow movement in what they would believe is the right direction, expanding by a point or two his lead over President Biden in some of these key battlegrounds. And they must be wondering, given what John Carl reported earlier and what our polling and others who have polled this question of independent voters and those who are on the fence, whether or not a felony conviction would change their minds, whether or not this has any impact on numbers that are already extraordinarily close.
Well, David, you mentioned the last several weeks the polls have been doing a bit better. It's also been the last several weeks that they can't capitalize on that because, as you well know, this was the first time in Donald Trump's life his schedule was out of his hands. He, of course, was stuck in that Manhattan courtroom. Recall, David, that he needed Judge Juan Merchan's approval to go to his son's high school graduation. So they know that this is now a tough situation. And look, David, all the reaction that I've been getting, Rachel, our colleague Catherine Falders as well, has been not surprised. It's New York. But let's be clear. This is not the verdict they wanted. So they can say they're not surprised by it, but it is something they now know they need to double down and pivot. One of the things, I know Rachel has heard this, as have I, that they are hoping is that they can quickly now get back to the campaign and move things forward. And one of the things that senior advisors to Donald Trump have been trying to get the former president to focus on is a running mate. Donald Trump has not engaged in conversations. Of course, names have popped up, names have been floated out there, many of whom have gone on and done what previous people who have wanted to be Donald Trump's running mate have done, which is defend him on camera, or in this case, which is interesting, right? Think about 2016 versus 2024. 2016 was who was on TV talking and saying nice things about me. 2024 has become who's coming to court with me. And we have seen many potential individuals, senators, governors, attorney generals who want to be in a Donald Trump round 2 White House go with him, David, to court, as we have seen in real time. So that's one of the things that advisors are hoping, if they can quickly pivot, quickly get out of New York, literally get Donald Trump out of New York and back onto the campaign trail, getting ahead with a Veep nominee, getting ahead with the RNC, moving into debates, quickly getting away from this conversation. And that's going to be hard, David, because look, as our team has noted, and we've already seen it, Donald Trump knows in some ways these cases, though with independents are not good with him, his base, it has helped. We've already seen fundraising emails fired out the second the verdict was released. Of course, Donald Trump knows that he's got to find a way to shore up support, and that's going to be a dance that his campaign now needs to move forward with.
John Santucci reporting with us here this afternoon on the guilty verdict, unanimous, all 34 counts, felony counts, the jury finding the former president guilty. As we look at this live picture, John, I just want to ask you, because we're watching, and there have been so many of these moments, but we'll stick with this one here as we watch the motorcade, the SUV, the Secret Service guide the former president back up to Trump Tower, obviously from Lower Manhattan, where the courthouse is, up the east side of Manhattan right here. And even though we have heard the former president repeatedly talk about, you know, his belief that this is rigged and political, we know, first of all, for a fact that the jury that was seated, both sides agreed to, that they come from various walks of life. And we also know that Donald Trump was a born and bred New Yorker. His father had a very successful real estate business here, a branding empire between father and son. Donald Trump enjoyed many, many years sort of being at the top in New York City. And to be in this SUV now, guided by the Secret Service back up to Trump Tower after being found guilty on 34 felony counts, Even though he says it's political, expresses disgust for what played out here in New York City today, this is a man who called himself a New Yorker for decades and who enjoyed significant success here.
It's an unbelievable story. A guy that was made by New York was just in some ways, you could argue, broken by New York. And think about it, right? You talk about Donald Trump's father, Fred Trump. Fred Trump succeeded in business, for those that know the New York area, outside of Manhattan. He succeeded in Queens and Brooklyn. Donald Trump wanted to outdo his father. It was breaking into Manhattan, crossing over the bridge to the island of Manhattan that was Donald Trump's goal. Donald Trump told voters in 2015 and 16 that I live in the most famous address ever, the most prized possession on Fifth Avenue. He loved living in New York, being a part of New York. You know, even in the last couple of days, David, I had heard from many senior aides and longtime friends to Donald Trump that he actually liked being in Trump Tower the last couple of weeks. Keep in mind, David, that was his residence for decades. He took such great pride and joy in it. I mean, many people have told this story. I experienced it myself the first time I went into Trump Tower, that Donald Trump loved to show off the views. Look at the Plaza Hotel. Look at Central Park. This was Donald Trump's pride and joy as a New Yorker. And to think that this is a city that he really spent his life trying to be a part of, breaking into. You know, as we're watching this helicopter follow his motorcade, I'm reminded of a video in our ABC archives of Barbara Walters with Donald Trump, talking about how he wanted to make the New York skyline different, put his impact on it. He's driving along right now, David. You got to imagine looking in part out the window, looking at the city that he had a big part of in some ways for many, many years. And this is a city now, David, that has left a very different impression on Donald Trump. And I mentioned earlier, but just think about it, right? You know, we all grow up, we all move away from home, life brings us in different places. But Donald Trump left New York because of a new job that he became president, but then left in protest because of these cases, because of these prosecutors that he said were out to get him. His children followed. His entire being in New York is no longer there. It's such a different life. As one person said to me when this case got started, think of everything Donald Trump had in 2015 before his foot stepped on the escalator. It's a lot of a different life now.
Certainly is a new chapter for Donald Trump in New York City, a city that made him, and as John said moments ago, today, a city that has profoundly impacted where things go from here, though whether or not this affects the outcome in November certainly is an open-ended question. You heard John Carl and Rachel Scott talk about fundraising, the immediate fundraising off of this. That is one advantage to this, but certainly there's a significant downside. We cannot overstate that. 34 guilty verdicts on 34 felony counts today by a jury of people agreed to by both the defense and the prosecution, a jury of Donald Trump's peers from all walks of life here in New York. And as we know, the judge had instructed that jury to look at this president, this former president, as a member of the community, and also instructed the jury not to allow bias, political beliefs to factor into this equation. Of course, every human brings some sort of opinion or viewpoint to any of life's experiences, but they were instructed not to bring their political opinions into that courtroom. They were also instructed not to base their verdict solely on the testimony of Michael Cohen, who has become such an extraordinary lightning rod, certainly in this case, and the judge telling them there must be corroborating evidence of a magnitude that would allow you to come up with the decision that they came up with today. John Carl, Michael Cohen has put out a statement.
Yeah, Michael Cohen has just put out a statement, David, and it reads, "Today is an important day for accountability and the rule of law. While it has been a difficult journey for me and my family, the truth always matters." So Michael Cohen, who we just heard in the closing statements by the defense in this case, Donald Trump's attorney call the gloat, the greatest liar of all time. Their entirety, I mean, the major thrust of the defense was that the central witness in this case, Michael Cohen, was a convicted liar, was somebody who simply could not be trusted. The jury didn't have to rely entirely on Michael Cohen's testimony, David, but Michael Cohen clearly was at the center of the prosecution's case. It was Michael Cohen who made the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels. It was Michael Cohen who was, now the jury has determined, reimbursed by the president, the former president of the United States, Donald Trump. And Michael Cohen now, in a rather muted statement from Michael Cohen, saying that this is a day where Donald Trump finally faced accountability.
Michael Cohen, who testified he took out a home equity loan on his own home to make that payment. And John, it was striking that the prosecution in their closing sort of took on that point, fully aware that the defense had basically called him the MVP of lying, the greatest liar of all time. The prosecution then telling those jurors in their closing arguments, listen, we didn't pick him up at the witness store. He wouldn't have been our choice. He was the choice of the former president to be his fixer and his lawyer.
And they made the point that that's exactly why Donald Trump hired him in the first place, because he was somebody, the prosecution argued, who would lie on Donald Trump's behalf, who would do anything on Donald Trump's behalf. Such was his loyalty to Trump. Cohen once famously said that he would be willing to take a bullet for Donald Trump. But when the prosecutors started honing in on Michael Cohen and on these hush money payments, it was Michael Cohen who was actually prosecuted first, not entirely for what happened with Stormy Daniels, but in part for what happened with these payments to Stormy Daniels. And Michael Cohen served time in a federal penitentiary long before Donald Trump was ever indicted for anything. Michael Cohen, who I believe the evidence is quite strong, believed he deserved a pardon from Donald Trump, never got that pardon from Donald Trump. And when Michael Cohen was prosecuted for this and Trump didn't do anything to help him out, Michael Cohen turned hard against the man that he had served so loyally. And that was part of the defense's case, was this is somebody who is out to get Donald Trump, who wants revenge. And frankly, David, I think the evidence and the prosecution basically acknowledged this in their arguments, their closing arguments. The evidence was there. Michael Cohen did want revenge, but the prosecution made the case that you don't need to just rely on Michael Cohen's testimony. There is significant evidence in this case that backs up the story he is now telling.
We are coming up on 6 o'clock here in the East. For many of you who might be tuning in for local news, at least in the eastern part of the country, you're watching ABC News live coverage of a significant day here in American history. Former President Donald Trump found guilty on all 34 felony counts in the hush money criminal trial here in New York City that, of course, involved that payment to Stormy Daniels in the weeks before the 2016 election. And it wasn't simply that the documents had been falsified. The argument the prosecution set out to make was that they were falsified in addition to trying to keep this information from the voters who had a right, they said, that was their argument, had a right to the information to make up their own mind before the 2016 election. It had been said when it comes to the testimony of Michael Cohen, you heard John Carl talking about Michael Cohen there. The defense had called him the greatest liar of all time. In that courtroom during closing, the prosecution saying we didn't pick Michael Cohen, we wouldn't have picked him as our key witness, but that it was former President Trump who picked him for those very reasons, those very skills, being able to lie, being able to fix, being able to make things happen. That's why Michael Cohen is playing such a large role in this case. That was the argument made by the prosecution. It had been said that even if Michael Cohen is a liar, that he would have a hard time fooling 12 New Yorkers in that jury box. Judge Juan Merchan instructing them, even in the end, through jury instructions agreed upon by both the prosecution and the defense, that the jurors could not find the former president guilty based solely on the testimony of Michael Cohen, that they must have corroborating evidence to the magnitude that would allow them to find the former president, guilty on all 34 counts in a New York City courtroom here late today. Josh Einiger of our station, WABC TV here in New York, Channel 7. Of course, that team doing extraordinary work trying to cover this day in and day out as well. Josh, you were in the courtroom. Describe the moment the jurors walked in and the former president's reaction to that verdict.
Yeah, so David, it's hard to overstate the wild shifts in the atmosphere in that courtroom over the course of really just a few minutes. I'll actually start a few minutes before that, which is when the judge called all the parties back to the courtroom at around 4:15. The jury was to deliberate until 4:30, and the judge told both sides he was going to let the jury go at 4:30, and then he left the bench. And over the next few minutes, Donald Trump was positively giddy with laughter with his lead attorney, Todd Blanche. They were laughing pretty heavily at the defense table and really all smiles. They seemed very relaxed. And it was really only a few minutes after that that the jury sent this note saying they had a verdict. So when they did enter, I think you heard Olivia Rubin say earlier, they walked in a very well-practiced eyes down, eyes forward, not looking at the former president, who was really just maybe a foot or two to their right as they have to file past him, and they got into the witness box. And then what I'll tell you is that from where we were sitting, David, we're not able to see his face. We can only see the back of his head, so it's hard to know what expression was on his face. But as they started to read through the counts, count 1, guilty, count 2, guilty, there was no motion at all in his body until they got to count 4, at which point he slowly started to shake his head. And that lasted for a few more counts. And then at around count 6 or 7, he was just still again, all the way through to count 34 when he was found guilty on all counts, David.
Any reaction were you able to see from Eric Trump, his son? Was his son still in the courtroom at that point?
His son, Eric, was in the courtroom sitting next to one of his attorneys, and no obvious reaction from him either. He was looking straight ahead, sort of ramrod straight, and did not betray any emotion. And then I will tell you, David, that when the jury did file out, it was that same awkward staging in the room that we've talked about so many times. They walked out now with him on their left. Some of the jurors actually turned their face to the right in the direction of the judge and away from the direction of Trump so that they would not have to make eye contact with him as they filed out of the room. And then when he left the room a few minutes after that, there was just a look of disgust. I have no other real word for it on his face as he walked out of the room, and then you saw him before the cameras after that.
We're looking at the SUV carrying the former president back up to Trump Tower here in Manhattan. And Josh, the moments after the verdict was delivered, we understand that each juror was then polled right there with the former president sitting at the defense table, each juror polled by the judge. And how did that play out? And I know you were sitting behind the president, very hard to tell his facial expression. But describe for me, if you will, that moment, and then what the judge then said to those jurors after their job was done.
So when the judge polled the jurors, he didn't poll them on each count. Of course, there are 34 counts, there are 12 jurors. He basically went through juror 1, is this your verdict? Juror 1 said yes, juror 2, juror 3. And during that time, Trump did turn in his chair and he was looking off in the direction of the jurors. No obvious expression on his face. It seemed fairly impassive. And then, at the end, the judge did thank these jurors for their service. He told them, I don't have a direct quote in front of me, but he told them how difficult this trial has been, how stressful this trial has been for them. He thanked them for their service and he excused them from the room. And then he asked them if it would be okay if after he excused them from the room, he would then go to them to have a conversation with them and thank them personally, one-on-one, and that was when they rose from the jury box. Everyone rose, including the former president, and then they filed out of the room, taking great pains not to look in his direction.
That's a very interesting observation, and I had wondered earlier when I had reported earlier on the air here that the judge told those jurors that he would be interested in their feedback, thanked them for what was a very difficult task, when that communication might take place between the jurors and the judge. Josh Einiger here of WABC reporting that the judge then planned on meeting with those jurors after they left the courtroom. And you have to wonder, Josh, and it's an impossible question to answer, you have to wonder if the foreperson or perhaps the two attorneys within the jury or who it was on that jury that got them all together and said, when we walk in, let's walk in a certain way, because your description and Olivia Rubin's description earlier on the air, really match up to a T. The decorum, the way they carried themselves, regardless of what you believe about this case, how they carry themselves is something that we can all observe and certainly appreciate, at least in their behavior. I know there are going to be a lot of opinions on the outcome of this trial, but to have walked in and to be concerted in their effort to sort of look down, not bring any more emotion or drama to a case that's already has historic implications here.
You know, David, it's hard to know, of course, as you point out, what the impetus was behind all of that. Part of it really could simply be that it was just uncomfortable for them. Here they are in this incredibly weighty position. The fate of the former leader of the free world is in their hands. And he's a pretty imposing figure, especially when he stands. So part of it could simply be that, kind of intimidation factor, or maybe an attempt not to allow themselves to be intimidated by that, type of stature, standing, that presence just to their right as they walk in or their left as they walk out. It was, though, as you point out, David, there were two attorneys on this jury. There were quite a few people with advanced degrees. So, there are people with life experience and wisdom, perhaps, who could guide the whole jury in terms of how it comports itself during this really historic and very stressful trial.
Josh Einiger of WABC TV. Josh is just one of several reporters who've been down there from the beginning for us, both through WABC and our network team here. There with Olivia Rubin and Aaron Kotursky, and we'll come back to each of them with our live coverage here. Again, you're watching ABC News live coverage. The former president being brought back uptown to Trump Tower in a city where 12 jurors have found him guilty on all 34 felony counts against him. It had been believed, as we were in day 2 of deliberations, the fact that the deliberations continued throughout today, they got close to that end time today. There had been some indication from the judge that the day would be wrapping up. Jurors might be going home. There was levity at the defense table between the former president and Todd Blanche, his lead defense attorney. They thought they were going home for the day when suddenly the judge said that jury has reached a verdict and they will be entering the courtroom shortly. A number of our reporters who were in the courtroom and in that overflow room that actually has a camera trained on the courtroom as well, all described very similarly the change in temperature immediately at that defense table. We had been reporting here over the last day or two that with every day that goes on, that gives a defense team a little more hope that there might be dissent among jurors within the jury. And that doesn't mean they're not still going to come up with the same answer, but as the days wear on, that's considered a better sign perhaps for the defense. And so that sudden turn at the end of today, Dan, must have been very unsettling for the former president and for Todd Blanche.
Yeah, look, a hung jury in this case, meaning one juror saying I'm not going to convict, would have been a big victory for Donald Trump. It would have meant any potential retrial wouldn't happen until after the election. If he wins the election, it wouldn't happen potentially until 2029. So they were certainly hoping at the least for a hung jury here. And I'll tell you, the fact that this jury came back today, it's pretty quick. Yes, you can argue this wasn't that complicated a case. That's true. As a legal matter, though, it wasn't that easy a case either. And the fact that these jurors came back after a half day yesterday, a day of deliberations today, came back with a verdict in this kind of case suggests to me that there wasn't much dissent on that jury. Because it'll be very interesting to hear when they initially went back there, did they poll the jury? Did they say, What are you all thinking? Let's do a quick hand raise. A lot of the time that happens in the jury room. Were they all saying that they thought guilty at the outset? Again, this was a pretty quick verdict to come back with 34 counts and suggest to me that if there was any dissent, there wasn't much.
Let's ask you a couple of quick legal questions for those who might have just joined us right around the 6 o'clock hour here in the East when people come to the TV for their local news. You're stuck with us a little earlier than normal here tonight, given the stakes at play here and this guilty verdict for former President Trump, guilty on all 34 counts. This does nothing, Dan, legally when it comes to running for president. He continues to run, no problem.
Correct, and he can vote, too. We were about to talk about it before. He can run for president, no question. The question of voting is based on New York state law because Florida defers back to the state where it happened. That's New York. In New York, really the only way you can't vote is if you're serving time, actually serving time. So he will be able to run for president and he'll be able to vote. The question's going to be when the sentencing is going to happen on July 11th. The question is going to be, even at that sentencing, whatever the sentence is, does it begin immediately? I think that there's a really serious chance that what will happen is that the judge will say, I'll allow you to appeal this. And while they're appealing, the sentence, whatever it is, would be put on hold.
This might be a little nuanced, but I find it interesting in all the reading because he has moved to Florida and made himself a resident of Florida. That's his home base now. That had the trial played out in Florida, for example, he would not be able to vote. Felons in Florida aren't able to vote.
Right. It would be a different law. It would be under Florida law. But again, Ron DeSantis could change that, right? As the governor, he could say, I'm going to pardon you, in effect, and allow him then to vote. So if it had been in Florida, Ron DeSantis, as the governor, would have control over not just the question of can he vote, but he could also pardon him with regard to any conviction as well.
But of course, it's a moot point because
Correct.
Even though he's a resident of Florida, they won't have to do anything to help allow him to vote.
Correct.
Because this played out in New York, where they would allow a convicted felon to vote unless they're serving time. Now, this is the question that came up earlier, and it is a question that people at home are going to ask. We know the sentencing is July 11th, by my count, 4 days before the Republican National Convention. It's still extremely unlikely that the sentencing would include any kind of time behind bars.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unlikely. You're talking about the lowest level felony here. You're talking about someone with no criminal record. One question I think some people will ask is, well, this is a defendant who has been attacking and trashing this judge. Even we just heard him do it moments ago. Could that play into the sentencing? Typically in a case, a lawyer would say, are you crazy? You're going after the judge who has complete and total discretion over what your sentence is going to be? I think this case is a little different. I think there's more of an expectation of the politics meets law aspect of attacking the judge. Question is, how will the judge react to that? Because he does have the discretion. We're talking about what would usually happen in a case like this. The judge could still decide that he wants prison time, but I think in the end that remains unlikely, even despite the very significant and personal attacks on this judge.
What do you think he does, the judge?
I think he's going to give him some sort of probation, maybe some sort of community service. There's a possibility of home confinement, which would be sort of a balance between the two.
We're watching the Secret Service here. They have arrived at Trump Tower, just south of Central Park, for those of you who know Manhattan. The former president returning to his home at Trump Tower. You can see the NYPD there telling people to continue on their way. Difficult thing, though, to get through to New Yorkers who know very well, obviously, as does the country, that this is something that certainly will divide many Americans, but it will be a day and a piece of history that we will not forget in a long line of sort of markers in this political climate of these last several years in our country. Former President Trump, you see here, arriving back at Trump Tower just a couple of hours after thinking that the jury would be going home for another night, that deliberations would go into a third day, and then the sudden turn in that courtroom when Judge Juan Merchan informed the former president, where you saw him there just moments ago on the sidewalk. Unclear whether or not he will address any reporters or those who are gathered there. Let's just listen to those who are gathered there on Fifth Avenue. Familiar gestures from the former president, though no words. A sort of rarity from the former president, and it's hard to decipher the differing chants. What we're hearing from folks there, though, those on the ground will be able to report that out later. One thing we did take note of over the course of this trial is that the crowds gathered in Lower Manhattan were small by comparison of what we have seen by way of rallies in the past or gatherings in support of or against the former president. And John Santucci, I want to bring you in on that. The fact that what we witnessed in Lower Manhattan over the last couple of weeks, there wasn't large-scale protesting outside that courthouse. I want you to weigh in on that, and also you have a reaction from Stormy Daniels just in.
Yeah, David, a couple things. First, if I could, David, just an observation from what we just saw of Donald Trump walking up in front of the building. David, I remember it almost like deja vu, and it's funny because it's so critical to what came up in this trial. The weekend that the Access Hollywood tape came out in October of 2016, that image that we just saw, David, is a rinse and repeat of what Donald Trump did the Saturday morning as he was hunkered down in Trump Tower, plotting what to do for his first run for the White House. He came outside the tower, he pumped his fist on the corner of 56th Street, looked around for a second, and walked back in. It is literally copy and paste what the former president did as a candidate under intense pressure, under what was at that point, David, the worst moment for his first campaign for the White House. And just to see that again as someone that has covered Donald Trump for that long, from that moment, it really is just an unbelievable image to see again a day after another one that was so horrible for him, to see him doing that exact thing. I mean, Donald Trump has a playbook. We know that. He talks about every day of his life being an episode of a TV show. It clearly seems like that one was a bit of a rerun, if you will. But just to go back to your other question, David, about reaction from many people around the former president, I've gotten a lot of texts in the last couple of moments here. Not surprised, angry, trying to find a way to pivot towards a way to get this campaign back on track and really move away from this courthouse. Donald Trump is probably tonight going to spend one of his last nights in Manhattan, and then it's back to Florida, where he is a resident now, and then quickly back on the campaign trail. David, just to your other question about Stormy Daniels, our colleague Olivia Rubin, who ran out of that courtroom and spoke to us, and then quickly got reaction from Stormy Daniels' attorney. Her attorney telling Olivia in a statement, quote, "Stormy is relieved that this case is now over. She always had great faith in our justice system and the solemn oath jurors take in undertaking their service. No man is above the law, and the selfless, hardworking service of each of these jurors should be respected and appreciated." David, that is an attorney for Stormy Daniels to our colleague Olivia Rubin here at ABC News. And you got to imagine, David, for tonight, going back to Donald Trump, if I can for a second, now that he is going back into that tower, back into that residence, he's going to be doing, David, what he did for so often when he would come home from the campaign trail. He's going to have cable TV on all night. He's going to be watching all of the coverage. He'll probably be watching us very shortly. We know that he still watches all of the evening newscasts on TiVo. He says it was one of the greatest inventions ever. And he'll be focusing on all of the commentary, taking this in. He'll start doing what he always does, working the phones, asking people, what do they think about this? It is going to be very hard for people to tell him much of this is good, because as we've talked about repeatedly, and you mentioned this earlier, David, and it's a great point and an important one, Donald Trump is obsessed with two sets of numbers. Ratings, he was always focused on TV ratings, and poll numbers. And we know that those polling numbers that have shown that if there was a conviction in this case, it could impact a small but important swath of voters. That is something he's going to be asking people when he starts doing the phone calls tonight. How many voters do you think? Could this be a problem?
I want to bring in Rachel Scott, who covers the race for president on that point. John, thank you. Stick with us here. Rachel, just looking at these numbers here, the latest ABC News Ipsos poll, 20% of Donald Trump supporters said they would reconsider or withdraw their support for him if he were convicted in the New York case. Now, of course, it's still early on. The numbers in these polls have showed, considerable movement back and forth, but within a range, which I always find fascinating this far out. This race is very close in this country. It's very close in the key battlegrounds, which we all know. The Electoral College is what decides these presidential races. But inside the campaign, they have got to be concerned about the potential if these numbers hold, because 20% of supporters who might reconsider changing who they would vote for could be just enough to make the difference in an election that's 1 or 2 points, at least nationally.
David, over the last several weeks, there are advisors in the Trump campaign, allies to the former president, who have simply just been concerned about the image of having the former president, a presumptive Republican nominee, inside of the courtroom. Now, the former president walking into Trump Tower, he was followed behind him with several campaign aides. They're going to walk into that building and have to contend with something that no other campaign has ever had to face in American history. And that is how to have a presumptive Republican nominee who is also a convicted felon now try to get to the White House. We have seen the former president bounce from the campaign trail back to the trial and the courtroom back to the campaign trail. And his advisors are in fact worried, as is the former president, as we know, that he keenly follows many of these poll numbers, how much of a political liability this is going to be for him, not only within his own base. We know, according to our ABC News Ipsos poll, that 80% of Trump supporters say they will stick with him, but it's that 20% who say they'll either reconsider or withdraw their support. And even when you look at other polls, 17% of independents in a latest Quinnipiac poll said that they might be less likely to vote for the former president if he's convicted of a crime. That is a big concern for the former president, because we know just how close this race could be. So even just having a small swath of those voters turn away from the former president could make all the difference in these critical battleground states. One group that is not turning away from him, David, I will tell you, it is the Republican Party. They have lined up one by one behind the former president. We're already seeing that reflected in the number of statements that we received since the verdict was actually reached and read inside of that Manhattan courthouse. And not only that, we saw something too that was pretty unprecedented, David. We saw a number of Republicans line up behind the former president at that Manhattan courthouse, including the second in line to the presidency, the Speaker of the House, David. They are standing by him as he goes through this.
You talk about the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and as you know, he was in that courtroom. In recent days, there has been, Johnson Tucci alluded to this earlier, a sort of tally of who showed up in that courtroom to show their political support of Donald Trump, who within the Republican Party, Speaker Johnson among them. And we know that politically up on the Hill, Speaker Johnson has tried to move forward certain issues that Donald Trump was putting pressure on Republicans not to move forward with. But on this particular point, they sort of cleared the deck. Speaker Johnson, in a show of political unity, showed up at that courthouse here in New York.
Yeah, and David, how rare is it to see the second in line to the presidency show up outside of a courthouse to defend a former president who was standing trial, who has just been convicted on felony counts? It was an extraordinary part that we have never seen before in American history. We've heard from the Speaker of the House today. He calls this a shameful day in American history. And of course, it wasn't just the Speaker of the House. There were 37 Republican officials that visited that Manhattan courthouse. We were talking about 2 Republican governors, 7 current or former attorney generals, 28 Republican lawmakers, and a lot of them were saying what the former president could not. We know that Donald Trump was under that very strict gag order, so a lot of those Republicans were coming out in a show of loyalty for the former president to rail against Michael Cohen, to rail against the witnesses, to blast this whole process, something that the former president was barred from doing under that gag order. It was a sign of loyalty to the former president. But David, this is a party that has only grown more closer to Donald Trump as he has been indicted and now as he has been convicted.
We have learned moments ago the Trump campaign says that their fundraising site is down because of the volume of people, supporters looking to show in sizable numbers, according to the Trump campaign, their support of the former president. And the former president posting himself, Rachel, on Truth Social.
Yeah, just moments ago, as the former president was making his way there to Trump Tower, he did post on Truth Social. He called this a disgrace. He claims that he is innocent. He says, "We'll keep fighting. We'll fight to the end," ending that statement by saying the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And it certainly will, David. It will certainly be up to the people of the United States to decide whether or not they want to put former President Donald Trump back in the White House.
Rachel Scott, our thanks to you as well this afternoon. Of course, these polls don't indicate that if they change their mind on Donald Trump because of a conviction, that they would necessarily vote for President Biden instead. But certainly a question moving forward in the polling will be whether or not certain voters in this country can stomach, if you will, voting for a convicted felon, and for those whom it makes no difference at all. That's going to be a question certainly asked of voters with greater intensity now that it is a reality. 34 felony counts late this afternoon here in New York. The former president found guilty on all counts in the hush money case involving the payment to Stormy Daniels, that payment made by Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's, handpicked for many years, fixer and lawyer. Cohen testifying that he took out a home equity loan to pay Stormy Daniels, and prosecution made the case that it was not just Michael Cohen here, that this was a concerted effort along with David Pecker, former publisher at the National Enquirer, to try to catch and kill, if you will, certain stories that might be damaging to then President Trump's as a candidate campaign leading up to the 2016 election. Again, as we know from jury instructions from Judge Juan Merchan here in New York, he told them repeatedly that they could not convict based solely on the testimony of Michael Cohen, that they must look at the totality of the evidence here. 6:27 here in the East. World News Tonight coming up in just moments. Our entire team standing by. These are images just moments ago, Fifth Avenue. The former president making familiar gestures that we have seen politically for many years now to the crowd gathered. The chants from the crowd, people chanting, most likely, if it's New York City, and we know New York well, with both viewpoints. And certainly we heard and saw that downtown, although the size and scope of the crowd downtown was much smaller than what we have seen along the way, certainly at political rallies and other moments of support or demonstrations against, really both kinds of demonstrations. What we saw at the courthouse in Lower Manhattan wasn't what we have seen certainly in recent years. Dan Abrams, a final thought from you as Judge Juan Merchan, as you say, will rely on suggestions from a probation officer, sort of extraordinary to wrap your head around this, that the former president of the United States, like any other convicted felon, will have to sit across from a probation officer, be asked several questions, and then that officer will suggest to Judge Merchan where to go from there.
Right. The probation department will make a recommendation. But I think in this case, the judge is going to kind of do this one on his own. Yeah. In a typical case, you need some advice from the probation department. You need to interview. You need to learn about the defendant. They provide a whole list of information, et cetera, about the person. That's supposed to help inform the judge's sentence. Here, the judge knows a lot about Donald Trump. I'm not sure he's going to need a lot of assistance from the probation department. Not sure that he's going to rely one way or the other on that. But there's a huge range here of possibilities in terms of a sentence. You're talking about anything from no jail time at all to up to 4 years in prison. No one expects anything like the top end. The question really just becomes any jail time at all. And as you and I have talked about repeatedly, I think that's unlikely.
And it's not 4 years for each felony count. It's 4 years over the course of all these counts.
Right. I mean,
it could concurrent.
It could, in theory, be 4 years, but it's not.
Yeah, that's just
correct. That's not a practical reality in this case, based on these particular crimes.
We will wait to see, and as you suggest, I certainly believe that is the case. Judge Juan Merchan certainly will be likely coming up with whatever decision he comes up with, mostly on his own. And he's had some time to think about this, certainly the potential that he would have to come up with a sentence for a former president of the United States who late today was found guilty on 34 felony counts in a New York courtroom. Again, the former president, Donald Trump, back at Trump Tower tonight, deciding what his next move will be as he continues in this race for president. World News Tonight begins right now.
This has been a special report from ABC News.